welcome back to the IEA channel. I'm Emily Carver, the Media Manager at the Institute of Economic Affairs. At a time when the government is exercising unprecedented powers, a fresh clampdown on freedom of speech is on the horizon. The Online Harms White Paper, which was published by the government in April 2019, calls for an independent watchdog to write a code of practice for tech companies. Under the plans, tech firms will be held accountable for what their users post and what their users share on their platforms, and penalised if they fail to take down offending content. The government intends to put the Online Harms Bill before Parliament next year. But does this bill represent a dangerous infringement on freedom of speech? Or is this a necessary step to ensure that vulnerable people and children are safe online? To discuss this, I'm joined by Radomir Tylecote from the Free Speech Union, Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute, and Caroline Elsom from the Centre for Policy Studies. If you enjoy this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. So, might I start with you, Radomir? You've written a briefing paper for the Free Speech Union recently entitled "Why the Government's Plans to Regulate the Internet Are a Threat to Free Speech." What are the issues you've highlighted, and where do you think the aims of this white paper have gone awry?
Thanks. So there are a number of problems that this legislation will pose for free speech. Some of it is obviously very well intended. When Home Secretary Sajid Javid launched the white paper originally in April 2019, he said he wanted the UK to have the toughest internet laws in the world. And of course, the government rightly talks about the need to protect children online, prevent the dissemination of images of child abuse, and deal better with the online activities by terrorists. The problem is that a lot of the other problems online that the white paper describes are vague, and these include so-called harms like unacceptable content and disinformation, which would be determined by a future regulator. In fact, the Online Harms White Paper itself never properly defines harm as such, and that risks outsourcing this definition to activists and lobby groups, and it hints that this should actually take place and that the taxonomy of possible harms should be extended. I think perhaps most troublingly, the white paper says that the new regulatory framework will make material that may directly or indirectly cause harm, even if it is not necessarily illegal, harder to find online. And that, I'm afraid, means that the new regulator is going to be empowered to censor lawful content. It also talks about making so-called authoritative news that has been fact-checked easier to find. And we regard that as almost a totalitarian approach. All in all, the white paper seems to treat the internet as, if you like, a problem to be solved, rather than a tremendous forum for debate that needs some specific resources and specific law enforcement targeted to the genuine harms that I've mentioned.
You argue in an article for Spiked, I saw, that censorship is the greatest online harm. How can that be true when there's so much violence on the internet, so much child abuse imagery and so forth, when it's so commonplace on the web? How can you possibly say that, you know, it's the censorship that's the greatest harm? If I could just press you on that.
Well, firstly, we agree entirely that there is a good deal that is harmful online. I would add, though, that given that a lot of that happens on the darknet, the dark web, this white paper arguably won't actually deal with that. That's why we've said that in order to deal with those genuine harms, there needs to be better resource for law enforcement agencies, among other things, and I'm sure we can talk about that in due course. The point about censorship is that there is really a battle going on for the future of the internet, and I think the government needs to be honest. That's why they need more specific legislation. In a way, it's ironic that the white paper concerns itself with dealing with so-called disinformation, because it dwells also on conspiracy theories and the harms from these things online. I think this suggests a worldview among some of the bureaucracy that sees individuals as incapable of making their own decisions and forming their own judgments from the free flow of information, and that's the point. It's authoritarian. The irony is that actually this worldview comes in itself from a kind of a conspiracy theory, because many people within bureaucracies now believe that recent political trends, so-called populist political trends, are due to people being manipulated online. But there's actually no evidence for this. And so that says to me that a lot of the people who are writing this kind of legislation in this country, in Germany and Brussels, are themselves believers in a kind of conspiracy theory that we're all heading for trouble unless people's information is vetted, and that people are being manipulated by others into political choices that they don't really understand. So of course there are specific harmful conspiracy theories, but the idea that you need mass censorship or state-approved fact-checking, as this white paper wants, is simply wrong, and I'm afraid it's not based on evidence.
Caroline, you've published a paper recently called Safety Without Censorship, a Better Way to Tackle Online Harms. How can you explain how you believe people can be safe from harm on the internet without any form of censorship?
It's a very important point there that you make, that there doesn't have to be a choice between censorship and safety. There is a middle line that can be struck where you can have a safer internet, but you can avoid some of the pitfalls that are highlighted in the white paper. I mean, Radomir is absolutely right that there are some very pressing free speech concerns to do with the white paper. And to go back to the real basics, according to Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and in our own Human Rights Act, there are some very, very clear rules that any infringements on freedom of speech have to be prescribed by law. And a lot of the harms that we see laid out in the white paper are not prescribed by law. They're completely legal things that you could walk down the street and say. And we have to be very mindful that we can't have a separate set of rules online and offline. The law has to be consistent. So my report that was out a couple of weeks ago highlights that there is a different model that can be used with some powers to Ofcom to tackle some of the most egregious acts that are already illegal, so that certain social media companies can be, there is some teeth to this regulation. But when it comes to legal speech that is completely legal to walk down the street and say, it is up to the government to decide whether it wants to make these types of harm that are currently legal illegal. So it has to be for Parliament to be very specific about particular types of harm if they would like it to be under the scope of Ofcom's regulation.
Matt, I know that you've spoken about the impact that this white paper, this legislation may have on innovation and on small and medium-sized businesses. Could you explain what your concerns are there?
Yeah, sure. I think this underlying issue at the heart of this white paper is this goal to remove all harm and to create a completely safe, sterilized universe. And the reality is that the government can't legislate good morals. And in fact, in the process, it causes a lot of unintended consequences. To begin with, they're going to seriously harm our free speech, as Caroline and Radomir have just so well explained. This goal to try talks about this in the original white paper, psychological and emotional impact of speech is just totally ridiculous and beyond any scope. It's kind of the Snowflake online charter, which this government seemed to not really like snowflakes at university limiting free speech, but seems to be doing it online themselves. Now, the practice of regulation, and we see this basically universally across every industry, is the more regulation you create, the more red tape that you put in place, the harder it becomes for small businesses. Big businesses like Facebook or Google or to some extent Twitter, although they're not quite as big as those two, they can more or less create the regulatory teams, they can influence, and you can rest assured that they are influencing the creation of this regulation, and then they will, what's known as capture the regulator. They will be very involved with Ofcom and the process of creating the guidelines that will then be used to censor internet companies. But what you're doing by creating this whole framework is creating a series of guidelines and a series of regulations that will be applicable to every company. So the smaller companies will find it very difficult to compete at the scale, because Facebook can, develop and deploy AI to try to deal with some of these harms that we're talking about. In fact, they already are, whilst it's much more difficult for the smaller companies, just as one example. is you're going to create a lot of barriers to entry. So the government, and we see this particularly out of the US, this week there's all these concerns about competition online, about the power of Amazon and Apple and Google and Facebook, but there's no consideration of the fact that when you create more regulation, it basically makes it near impossible for anyone to compete. Facebook could not exist today if Mark Zuckerberg had to ask for permission. If there's something that goes around that says that if Zuckerberg wanted to set up a coffee shop down the road, he would have had to have got 10 licenses of the government. But he could basically create Facebook permissionless, and that was the great power of the internet. And that's actually why we've seen so much innovation on the online space, and we've seen so little innovation on the offline space because we're regulated it so heavily. I think this regulation, this proposed framework, is a real return to the world of the offline, where everything is heavily regulated and competition is severely limited by that. And Zuckerberg said this himself last year when he was providing evidence before the House Judiciary Committee. At one point, he admitted the fact that he could deal with all the new regulations the government was putting in place, but his smaller competitors can't. And I think that's a key reason why we have to be quite careful about creating these huge regulatory frameworks that only very few people could ever understand and very few people can comply with, and make them then apply to every single company, no matter how big or small they may be.
Caroline, do you think that this, I mean, Matt's made the case there that this is bad for small businesses. Is it not the case that the government are trying to threaten big business and that this may be a little overblown, or do you share Matt's analysis completely there?
Well, I think Matt raises some really pressing points there, that the little companies really can't compete if these regulations come in their present form. There is no minimum number of employees or minimum turnover that would bring you in scope of these rules. It's left completely up to the regulator to decide if you're going to be regulated or not, and whether you will be sanctioned at all. And this is really unfair. If you're 5 teenagers trying to set up a new app, probably at the moment working out of your own bedroom trying to get this set up, you don't have in-house counsel who you can go to if you're not sure about how the regulation will apply to you. You don't have some of the top expensive lawyers on retainer if you have something that you would need to fight in court against the regulator. And this is really problematic because it means that only the big social media companies really have the firepower to ever ask Ofcom how the laws are being applied to them and whether they're in the right place. And we've already seen this with the Information Commissioner and GDPR. Only big companies have been able to fight the fines and avoid liability, or they've been able to kick the cases into the long grass. There are several cases ongoing. One of them is Marriott Hotels, and Facebook's also had cases where they've managed to delay and either avoid liability, avoid fines, or the cases have never been completed. And it's only the big companies that can do that, and the little guys aren't going to have a look in at all.
Yeah, going back to you, Radomir. So Caroline earlier gave some of the recommendations from her report. Have you looked into how a better white paper might look like, or what specific recommendations you would make to members of Parliament who are concerned with this legislation?
Yeah, there are various things here that it's worth dwelling on, and at the FSU we're going to be releasing a briefing in the coming weeks about what we think the better regulation, better white paper would look like. I mean, the first thing is, one of the problems with online harms as it stands is that it tries to apply what looks like a vast dragnet of regulation to something extremely complex, namely the internet. And it's really as if people have got together and said, let's name as many harms as we possibly can and put them together in one white paper. So it doesn't make sense to me to have one piece of legislation that would deal with bullying here, intimidation there, internet addiction there. So I think there need to be separate approaches to this. And as Caroline has discussed in her recent paper, I think the government needs to decide whether it's dealing with illegal or legal harms, and certainly we don't want any more infringement of free speech, online or offline, or indeed tacitly approve of infringement of free speech as far as it's gone. So because of this dragnet, you will indeed, as the others have said, have this vast censorship by firms as the big firms deploy AI to try to control and remove all sorts of things that should just be a part of debate, apart from the genuine illegal harms, such as harms to children, which of course is something different. This is a major problem for internet startups, and the government has said that one of the aims of the white paper is to make Britain, is to make the UK the best place to start up a digital business, and I'm afraid it will prevent that, because it will entrench incumbency, and that's something that legislation actually needs to deal with, is removing incumbency, or the benefits of incumbency, from online firms. Apart from that, we'd say that children, for example, will be better protected online, and more can be done to deal with child abuse online through an improved sentencing regime, in particular tougher sentences for individuals convicted of acts which are already illegal. And actually there's some re-legislation going on here by the white paper. So simply re-legislating as it proposes won't actually make children safer, and it's not clear why the government are not considering tougher sentencing as a part of the solution to online harms. So we've recently seen individuals over the summer convicted of possessing the most serious categories of child abuse material online, and they have received suspended sentences and walked free. That to us is just an obvious area. Also, you need more resources for the relevant functions of the National Crime Agency and for individual police forces. So actually there is a lot that the government can be doing to better protect children, to deal better with the use of the internet by terrorists without infringing free speech.
Yeah, I think Radomir is absolutely right there, because what the online harms regime focuses on is not the people actually doing the harm, not the users who share child exploitation material online. It's only trying to deal with the platforms, with the discussion forums, with the people who host that material. So I think it would be much better if the government actually focused in on where the harm is happening, as Radomir said, and ensure that the criminal justice system is resourced properly and the existing laws deal with that. I would also add on top of that it would be much better, just from a simple basic policymaking perspective, not try to do everything, but try to focus on a narrow set of universally agreed harms, that are problems that we need to address. And that means, in the first instance, removing this category of legal but harmful. If something is legal speech, you need to make a separate case for making that illegal speech, and you should pass legislation to deal with that, and that should be a matter for civil society. It's not a matter for government to have any concern whatsoever about what is legal speech. So I think the government would be wiser, rather than trying to do everything with this framework but misallocate the blame to social media companies rather than the individuals who are doing the things that are unlawful and are genuinely harmful. They could be more focused and far more effective by focusing on where the actual harms are.
Caroline, is it even the duty of government to try to remove harm from the internet? Is it something that will always be the case, and is it sort of almost impossible to regulate such a mass of material that's out there? And are the government fighting a losing battle? Is this just to show that they're trying to do something? And what can we hope for in terms of realistic ways of making the internet safer, whilst also ensuring that the UK is the best place to do business in the world?
I think this is a huge problem that you've highlighted about perceptions of what online harms regulation will do and what it can reasonably do. As has been raised already by Radomir, the darknet exists, and it's almost completely overlooked in the online harms white paper. There's whole swathes of the internet where the worst instances are happening of harm that aren't captured by this regulation at all. So I think there is a point to be made here about the fact that the government is setting itself up to fail if it's raising the expectation that it will be able to sanitize the internet in its entirety, and it shouldn't be aiming to do that. We shouldn't be aiming for an internet where you're looking at it from the eyes of where you're looking at the whole of the internet from the eyes of a child, and everything has to be wrapped in bubble wrap. The internet is a really important forum for ideas to be shared, and it's changed our lives. Not least at the moment when everyone is existing in this online world behind their screens and going about their lives. So yes, I think that there are some questions about what the government should really be aiming to do, but there are meaningful improvements that can be made to safety without infringing on censorship. As has been raised, there's a massive drop-off rate between what the industry does, which the industry is really good at, making referrals to the National Crime Agency and to the police about things that they have flagged on the internet which are illegal and they would like to be investigated. And it goes to the police, it goes to the National Crime Agency, and then there's a huge drop-off rate in what police forces are actually able to do, because there is so much data out there, and police forces are not, in the large part, trained well enough in order to be able to deal with the sorts of data that is coming on their plates to tackle these harms. So at the moment, more than ever, when the government is going to have to be making some very difficult choices about how money is spent over the coming years with an uncertain economic outlook, choices have to be made about whether you're giving money to or very beefed up powers as well to a large bureaucratic regulator, or whether that money might actually be better spent going to policing functions to catch the criminals behind the keyboards who are actually committing these acts of harm and creating the content that is harming people online.
Just to finish, thanks Caroline, just to finish, because I'm not sure myself, where are MPs, what are they sort of thinking at the moment? Are they listening to these concerns? Are you hopeful that there will be meaningful change to this white paper and to when the bill goes through Parliament? Are you feeling positive that the concerns that you're raising are being heard?
Yeah, I'm always relentlessly positive about this, and there has been some really good engagement from the report Safety Without Censorship that was published a few weeks ago. However, there are still some very strong and vocal voices, as we've seen this week with Westminster Hall debate on online harms, that politicians are still trying to add yet more things into the scope of the online harms regulator. There was discussion about adding counterfeit goods into the mix. There was discussion about giving it beefed up powers over pornography. As has been said by both Matt and Radomir here, in trying to do so much, the regulator will doom itself to fail unless it can be much more narrow and specific about which types of content it is going to go after. So, yeah, the politicians are still listening, but I think that there needs to be a serious conversation now as we approach an online harms bill probably coming early next year now, about what public expectations will be of what an online harms regulator is and what the government can actually do.
I just make one last point, which is that I think the government should be particularly wary about creating a framework of online censorship, particularly a conservative government, because inevitably the rules that are created will be taken advantage of by people who are not necessarily of the same disposition. We already see this online, where tech companies are quite consistently far more censorious of conservatives, and we know that the regulatory state and these regulators are not going to be particularly friendly towards conservative speech. So I think that the government would be doing itself a lot of self-harm and its own future potential a lot of self-harm if it seeks to what is ultimately a censorship regime for its own, potentially for its own activists, as well as just a broader legitimacy point about free speech. If the government is going to have any legitimacy in global terms talking about free speech, it really shouldn't be going down the line of somewhere like China or Russia when it comes to censorship. The government's currently trying to put claims to Nigeria about the fact that they've arrested the head of the Humanist Society, Mubarak Bala, who's been in jail for over 100 days because he was provocative and annoying to Muslims on Facebook, and he now potentially faces death penalty under blasphemy laws. And we don't want to create a kind of legal framework in the UK which basically more or less provides justification when it comes to so-called hate speech, and starts quite substantially censoring the internet, because we have to worry quite substantially about where that puts Britain in the world and whether or not Britain is truly a country of free speech and liberal freedoms.
I completely agree with that, actually. And if I could just add something on that point, I think the government probably misunderstands public opinion if it believes that there is a clamour for more censorship and more hate speech law. I don't think that's the way public opinion is going. I think this is a really good opportunity for the government to demonstrate that it is on the side of free speech and look again at this law. It's also worth considering something that Ruth Smeeth of the Index on Censorship has recently warned about. There are liable to be side effects of some of these aspects of regulation if the government isn't careful. So it's understandable they want to do something about self-harm and the promotion of self-harm online. At the same time, there are young people who use the internet to talk about their problems, help avoid self-harm, and get counselling notices. And as we've said, this dragnet type of legislation risks censoring any discussion of these problems. Ruth Smeeth has said that you wouldn't want to end up in a position where Facebook, in particular, is turned into simply a forum for dancing cats. And I'm afraid the sanitised internet model that the government seem to want to go down risks taking us there.
Yes, and it would just push people underground, I guess, to the dark web anyway. So thank you so much for joining me, Matt, Radomir, and Caroline.